wrapped up in the things you are here to fulfill. Whatever you choose for a career path, remember the struggles along the way are only meant to shape you for your purpose.
Welcome to In Bloom. I am your host, Michaela Richmond, and this is a pro-humanity podcast.
Alrighty, thank you so much for coming to the next episode of In Bloom. This is going to be part 2 with Steve Patterson. If you haven't seen part 1, I would go ahead and recommend doing that first, but let's get into this episode. Interesting. Okay, slight caveat. Do you study any other languages? Because English is a very, very limited language, especially for like describing experiences in the world.
I have studied a little French, and I'm learning a little bit of Japanese, and I'm interested in Romance languages generally. So one of the things I was able to do is travel for my podcast, Patterson In Pursuit. And as I was traveling, I noticed that Romance languages all look very similar to me, where, like, for example, we were in Norway, and I was reading some Norwegian, and I'm like, I don't know anything of Norwegian, and yet I can sort of piece these words together because they're very similar. So I'm not formally studying them, but I agree. I think there are concepts that are not encapsulated by the English language. And, you know, if you go into that's why there are phrases, people who are multilingual will have phrases from another language that they poured into their mother language because we don't quite have the right concept to capture what they want to capture.
Why do you think that is? Like, what went wrong?
I don't think anything went wrong. I think it's just so complicated. There are so many possible concepts that it makes sense that you have, these concepts can be very sophisticated and emerge over long periods of time with complex social interactions and histories of thought and experiences from different groups of people. So I think you would sort of expect that not every language is going to be able to capture every concept. It's just the world is too complex for that.
Okay, that makes sense.
That's the way I see it. I don't know. Maybe there's something deeper there that I'm missing.
I don't know. Maybe I'll bring that up another time with somebody else who maybe studies anthropology or some sort of history. That would be fun. Okay, so you talk about naturalism as kind of the philosophy that you study right now and that you're into right now. In the past, I believe you were pluralist, correct?
Yeah. So it's both.
Okay.
So naturalism is the idea. Naturalism is an ambiguous word. There's lots of different interpretations of what that word means. What I mean by it is that you can explain phenomena that we experience through describing the natural operations of the universe. Now, that's not to rule out miracles with an asterisk. It's just to say, if there are miracles in the world, I think there are naturalistic mechanisms for them. Let me give you some interesting examples. Yeah. So if in the Bible, there's stories about, I think it's like in ancient Egypt, there were frogs raining from the sky. Something happened, I don't know, God was upset, and frogs started raining from the sky. Now, that might sound like an utterly ridiculous thing that could happen. It's like, it doesn't take much knowledge to say frogs can't rain from the sky. But it turns out frogs can actually rain from the sky because, and this is crazy. It's not just frogs, it's all kinds of sea creatures. And you can Google them and they're on YouTube. What happens is you'll get a tornado over a body of water, a water spout, and the water spout sucks up the sea creatures, shoots them up into the sky, and then they rain. So like it rained squid in Texas. I don't know, I think it was last year. It doesn't happen very often. Oh. Yeah, it's a thing. It's like raining animals. That's an actual thing.
Oh my gosh.
So I look back over these old ancient stories and they say things that sound ridiculous. Frogs fell from the sky. And I'm like, okay, I bet frogs actually did fall from the sky, but there's a mechanism for that. And it would make sense that people who lived 3,000 years ago who were recording the stories did not have knowledge of water spouts. Mm-hmm. They didn't know what the mechanism was, but there was an ultimate mechanism. They just said, well, this is obviously something divine, or like fire raining from the sky. And if you look at fire tornadoes, for example, it looks like how these things are described in ancient texts. So I think there is a place for miracles in naturalism. And you can even have miracles of significance. So just to spitball here, right? There's also a story where Moses parts the Red Sea. And like, well, that sounds ridiculous, until you realize that there can be, I forget what they're called. They're like downdrafts from the clouds that have these insane bursts of air that go down, 300 miles an hour or however insanely fast. And if they're over a shallow enough body of water, they can part the sea for a temporary period of time. So like, what if it's the case? This is a crazy idea. What if it's the case that, a few thousand years ago, you had this guy, Moses, who was a spiritual leader in his community. And he had such belief in the operation of the universe that, unbeknownst to him, he had no idea the mechanisms. He did not have an understanding of physics. At the right time, he had his group of people with him, and he was like, all right, well, we have a sea to cross. Here we go. And he slams his staff in the ground, and the seas part. Now that could have happened, and you could even ascribe some divinity to it, like, wow, that the universe should have been orchestrated such that happened at that moment is a miracle. And yet there could still be a naturalistic, mechanical explanation of what's going on. So it's like a mixture of profound coincidence with actual, like, nothing. There's no magic per se. It's just like, divine coincidence plus an underlying mechanism that gives it that spiritual profundity, even though it's like, oh, it's just a down spot. It's downdraft from the clouds. Oh, it's just some crazy mechanism, or like water into wine. I don't know what's going on there, but I might be able to say, yeah, maybe at that particular time, at that particular place, there was something funky in the water, and there was some cause for that effectively turned the water into wine. But it's not magic. It's just some unknown feature of the universe that we don't quite know yet. We don't know about yet. So that's a long way of saying, yeah, that's the naturalistic aspect. Yeah.
I would have to be more convinced on the water into wine aspect, because like that's an interesting one, but I almost think it makes it more profound to think about it from the naturalistic. The fact that in that exact moment, all of these things happened all at once,
right,
and it created this exact thing is like,
yeah,
wow.
Yeah. And imagine that happens a lot. Like, people report experiences all the time where they say it seems like a divine coincidence. And what if there's just what if there are naturalistic mechanisms for divine coincidence? I'm totally open to this idea. In fact, that explains my experience
explain that a little
as well.
bit more, though.
Yeah. So for example, well, no, I'm not going to go into detail on that one. So just the frogs raining from the sky, right? So we could tell one story. This is a hardcore, like, naturalist approach. We say there was a weird weather pattern that sucked up frogs from the lake because there was a tornado, shot them up into the sky, and dropped them on ancient Egypt. Naturally, because that was such a bizarre phenomenon, stories emerged that sound whimsical, but that are religious in nature. But there's no spiritual significance to them. They're just ascribing spiritual significance there because of a random naturalistic phenomenon. If a meteor struck, you could just totally physically explain that as, there was a big impact event that happened and people told stories about it. Okay, that's possible. I'm open to that. But imagine that's not really what's going on. Imagine it just so happened that right before the frogs rained from the sky, this one Moses dude was like, listen, Pharaoh, if you don't let my people go, you're going to get divine wrath and frogs are going to rain from the sky. And then frogs rain from the sky. Now, if that actually happened, you go, okay, well, what's going on here? Like, sure, there's a naturalistic mechanism, but the fact that it happened when it did and was predicted, that requires additional explanation. Or like, to use the meteor example, imagine that there's some, there's another biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah, these two cities that were destroyed. Well, maybe they were literally destroyed by meteor impact. Like, that would be a naturalistic explanation. But also, what if it's the case that people predicted it and they said, listen, let's say I'm a prophet. I'm like, you guys are living terribly. God is very upset at you. And if you don't change your ways, you guys are going to be erased from the map. And then it happened. Now, if that's the world we live in, I'm thinking, well, there's something else going on. It's not just the naturalism itself or the physical explanation itself. There's clearly something else that needs explanation here, which is, how can you explain prophecy like this, if it actually happens. I'm not saying this is what happened because I don't know the details surrounding these events, but I can entertain the idea that these types of things happen, and that then you're automatically in some kind of weird, supernatural universe where some people have foreknowledge, but they don't know how they have this foreknowledge, and I don't know. That would be an example where you get to rescue a modern understanding of physics and causality with spiritual claims and claims of the ability that prophecy actually works in some weird cases. You can have both of those things at the same time.
Prophecy is definitely an interesting thing. So interesting. Would you apply this same kind of a thought process to life, like the fact that you exist, the fact that I exist?
Totally. Yeah, and well, we have to be particular on what we mean by you and what we mean by me.
Okay.
So the thing that gets me is consciousness. I think we can tell a story. I'm not totally convinced.
What is consciousness to you?
So that's just the word I use to describe the fact that I'm having internal experiences, feelings, sensations, emotions, conscious thought, awareness. That's the word that I'm using. And I don't find the physicalist story compelling here at all. I don't have a good, purely mechanical explanation for why consciousness should exist at all. And there are really difficult philosophical problems here. I could go into some detail if you like, but one example is some people want to say that consciousness has no causal effect on the world. You can't actually choose to do anything because they think that would break the chains of causality. They're hardcore physicalists, and they say consciousness doesn't actually change anything because, like, how could you choose to move an atom in one way that it wasn't already going to move? That sounds magical, mysterious. The trouble is, if consciousness doesn't have any causal impact on the world, why should it exist at all? It's like this very expensive process. You get this big brain, all of the blood is going up there, all the nutrients is going up to your brain to give this running experiential phenomena that's taking place. But if there's no causal impact in the world, why would it exist? Like, what is the evolutionary explanation for a non-causal consciousness? Why should we be experiencing anything? Why couldn't it just be physical bodies going about their business without any internal experience? That's a very difficult puzzle. I've never heard anybody try to solve that from the physicalist perspective.
That's so interesting. Today I was reading a book, the book that I told you about, The Evolving Self, and it was basically he was talking about consciousness, and he was proposing, and I had never thought about this before. He was proposing the fact that evolutionarily speaking, we have not always been a conscious species.
Yeah. There's been a few people who have made this. This is an interesting claim.
Do you agree with this? Do you? I don't know.
I couldn't possibly say. I think I don't have enough specified knowledge here. And sometimes when I listen to claims of even historians who aren't talking, a million years of evolution, they're talking like 300 years of history, I tend to be very skeptical.
Why?
I'm totally with historical claims. For example, imagine you were going to try to capture the truth of what happened with the coronavirus by going through 30 years from now and digging up old journal newspaper articles on it. Do you think that somebody 30, 50, 100 years from now is going to actually track the truth of our present moment by reading the news in the future? I don't think so.
Okay.
So if that's true in the present, I think it's also true of the past, that there's so much power in being able to write history. You can say this and this happened. This is the authoritative history in X, Y, and Z. But every time there is this much power, there are people lying like mad all over the place. And I think there's also, you got to think, most people throughout all of history were not literate. So you have a tiny amount of people that even have literacy that are largely connected to the government and the state and people in power. What are the chances that they knew the truth in a very complex world and accurately communicated it? I think very, very low. So, and then there's there are a bunch of epistemological questions where there are assumptions being made by historians that aren't very well justified. It's just they assume things because that makes it easier to tell a compelling story, coherent story. So so even with like human history, I tend to be very skeptical of a lot of claims that are made. And then when people start telling me about what consciousness was like a million years ago, I'm like, yeah, that's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of speculation.
Mm-hmm. No, I would agree with that. But how do you get to the truth about history?
Well, can you get to the truth about history? It's another question.
Yeah, big question.
So I don't think you can.
Okay.
I think I think there's partly a technological hope that we have here, which is so in observing the world, especially in the past few years, I have seen the way that power operates, political power, and even non-political power, and it's very ugly.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you only have one voice who's trying to say the truth, try to tell the official narrative, I would bet lots of money that that narrative is false. But we do have some pretty incredible technology as of recently, like YouTube, for example, people recording life as it is on their phones, where you can just see what they saw yourself. And that to me has more veracity to it. So another area I've been researching a lot is illness, because my wife and I have been dealing with some chronic illnesses. And the amount of disparagement that a lot of people in the chronic illness community get from the establishment, from the officials, from the powers is crazy. Like this happened again with the AIDS crisis in the 80s. There was apparently a lot of people who were saying they're making it up. It's not actually a crisis. This is all nonsense. And then they find out eventually, oh no, they weren't making it up. This is an actual medical problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? So imagine that you had the people who were suffering who all have cell phones and can record their actual experiences and put them up on YouTube. And now you don't need a historian to interpret that for you. You don't need some political person to tell you the way things are. You can just check their YouTube channel and see what history was like at that era. So I think going forward, we might have more reliable history because it's like direct recording rather than filtered through layers of humans. So I'm a little more optimistic in the future, but looking in the past, yeah, it's definitely difficult.
I like that a lot. I haven't thought about that in terms of like, I love to think about the different structures that could exist in the future and how they could actually help us. And that's an interesting idea of legitimate history, like not recorded history, but legitimate video proof
Right.
of history.
Right.
But how, like, and I don't know if you've thought about this, so if you haven't, then it's okay. But how would you get to a place where even today we have the algorithms that will put in front of you the things that you are used to seeing?
Yeah.
How do we not have that in the future as well? Or like, how do we not have a narrative, I guess?
So we have a different problem than our ancestors faced, right? They were not overwhelmed by information. Their problem was we only have a teeny tiny amount of people who are recording the information,
Mm-hmm.
and they have all kinds of personal biases and epistemic problems, and they're connected to power. That's the problem they faced. It's a significant problem.
Mm-hmm.
Our problem that we face is the exact opposite, which is total information overload. We can have, and we have people recording millions of hours of trivial footage that how are you going to sort through it? Not an easy question. So we're going to have algorithms. The question is, well, it's actually an interesting idea here, because we have seen that if you're over-reliant on the algorithm to feed you information, eventually power is going to corrupt it, and you're going to be spoon-fed information that people want to feed you. Now that's different than, YouTube didn't always used to work this way. Like YouTube, right now, if you a bunch of recommended videos, half of them are from, CNN and Fox and like the approved thing. It didn't used to be that way. It's only a fairly recent thing. It used to be a bunch of crazy people, right? It was like people on the ground uploading their crazy videos about whatever. And I think you can still search for that content. You'll be able to find it. And if it's not on YouTube, some platforms are going to pick it up.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that is an ongoing problem that future generations are going to face. And it's also an entrepreneurial opportunity, because if you can try to solve the information overload problem, wow, that's a really valuable service. I'm going to be doing some of that in my work, like to find good thinkers here and there that in their areas are doing high quality work. Well, I found them. And that's really valuable if other people like my methodology, my sorting process. I can say, okay, well, look, I'll connect you to other minds that are doing high quality work. So, and I think that's also something people get paid for. So going forward, that's what it's going to be. It's going to be an imperfect process that, if you can try to solve that problem, you're doing a social good.
How do you still not get into groupthink though? Because like if you have different people that are kind of synthesizing, these are the people that are thinking like I am, these are the people that are thinking like I am. How do you not have people that are just going so deep into the rabbit hole of one topic? I mean, they already kind of do, but like
Yeah.
how do you not have that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that is answered by every individual. Now,
Mhm.
I think the way to do it is you listen very carefully to all sides of any issue. If you're actually trying to gain understanding, you have to listen to the mainstream. You have to listen to who they disparage. You have to listen to the minority and the thinkers that they think are good, and you have to evaluate their ideas for yourself. That problem can't go away. And I also don't think that merely having individuals who are synthesizing other people's knowledge is going to solve this problem by itself. Because as you pointed out, you can just listen to, somebody could just listen to what I say. As like, you're not going to be informed and knowledgeable if you just listen to what I say. You got to listen to what I say, the people that I recommend, who they recommend, who their opponents disparage and think are terrible. You got to listen to all of them and actually try to evaluate the ideas for yourself. That's literally the only way to avoid groupthink. Otherwise, all you're doing is groupthink.
But how do you get a society that wants to do that? Because that's difficult.
I mean, that if I had that question, yeah, I would be, I don't know, I would be some superior being or something. I have absolutely no idea. It seems to be fewer and fewer people by the day who are interested in genuine understanding and not interested in the groupthink thing. I think because we're experiencing social decay in all kinds of different areas, there are more pressures to conform, to find your group and conform. And to, it's sort of like pressure to find a religion, find your religious community and stick with them, and create the out group and create the strong in-group bonds. And there are enormous pressures to do that. How do you change it? I don't know. I would say, if I were to put my prophecy cap on, I don't think it's going to change. I think what's going to happen is you're going to get further and further fracturing, further and further groupthink. There's going to be some type of crisis, maybe a war, maybe government falls apart type thing, or communities fall apart. And I think you're going to have permanently separate communities. I think effectively what we're seeing right now with people being so isolated and angry is the emergence of new religions. I think going forward, you're going to have a bunch of, well, I don't know if they have names yet, but it'll be like the Fauciist religion, like the people that are listening to Anthony Fauci and the declarations of the authoritative medical community that happens to be connected with government and big pharma and whatever. There's going to be a lot of people who refuse to listen to the other side of the argument, and they're effectively captured by this new religion. I don't know if it's going to be a formal religion, but it's going to look like a religion from the outside. They're going to have a formal hierarchy. They have their experts that you don't question. Maybe you pay them for their wisdom and their salvation. Like it's going to look like a religion. You're going to have people on the exact opposite, like, just to go with the political themes, like the Trumpist narrative, the Trumpism as a political phenomenon. I don't expect that there's going to be a meeting of the minds and they'll synthesize and harmonize and work it out. I imagine they're going to hate each other and split as if it's a religious schism. And you're going to have groups, and they have their own hierarchies and their own beliefs and their own systems and that type of thing. So I think that is what the future is going to entail. And then there's going to be a few people who see through it, who maybe can try their best to be rational and promote rationality and critical thinking and listening to both sides and thinking for yourself. I think they're going to be in the minority for a little while, though. Now, after that, I will say, I really am optimistic. So that's kind of a pessimistic picture I've painted. But in the long run, I really am optimistic because I think, and this might be naive, I don't know. I think at the end of the day, the truth wins out. And I think the connections and the systems and the culture that is going to be built around the critical thinkers is just going to be better than the alternatives. I think so. I think it's very plausible that I'm short-term pessimist, which makes me long-term optimist, because I'm thinking, okay, existing systems are going to fail. It's going to be ugly, but there's going to be a phoenix rising from the ashes, and I'm really excited about it. There are a lot of people, Well, there are an increasing number of people, I would say, who want nothing to do with critical thinking. And I think there's also an increasing number of people in absolute terms who are waking up and saying, okay, whatever we're doing right now is not working. The information overload, information manipulation, control thing, this is not the path we want to go on. So.
This is so interesting. I would consider myself highly optimistic as well. I don't know in the short term. I think that is something that's very, very up in the air for me. Just like I almost don't want to believe it because it's one of those things where it's like how COVID was. Nobody expected it. And then it's just like, oh my gosh, it happened. And now everybody's kind of in an interesting state. And I think that will probably be how it is. It's just like at one point, if anything turns, it's going to turn quickly and everybody's going to be kind of shocked.
Yeah.
I do believe in the phoenix rising from the ashes kind of a thing. It's just like time and time again throughout the different stages of history, throughout the different generations, there have always been people that have you hit a really low and then you rise up. And so I love that idea. I really hope that ends up becoming a thing. I almost have to have hope because I don't know. I guess nothing would be worth it without it.
Yeah, well, I think that's the right position to have. And there is something very hopeful about the fact that we have a lot of power. So there's this philosophy of disempowerment. People are like, all of this is external to me. I have no ability to control it. I just don't think that's true at all. What I don't think you have the ability to do is control the country. I don't think you can control 300 million people. I think don't worry about that. I think we actually have the ability to build meaningful connections, relationships, networks, businesses right now that can last through whatever happens. I really do think that, which is very empowering and optimistic. It's like, look, find the people now that are going to grow with us, that are not going to try to throw us into concentration camps if things get really bad, and we have power and influence. And the other thing is we have technology that is just spectacular. So there are so many atrocities that could have been committed in the dark and have been committed in the dark because people are disempowered, genuinely disempowered, and they don't have the ability to share their experiences or what happened to them or the terrible things that happen, abuses that have happened. Well, now everybody's walking around with a camera in their pocket that can stream directly to the internet to capture abuses as they happen in real time. So I think that puts enormous constraints on what institutionalized evil can get away with. I think it's we can leverage this technology in a really awesome way. I also think too, like my suspicion is going forward. So I'm very focused on ideas right now, and I think that the intellectual classes that are going to emerge are going to look very different with the internet than they looked without the internet. It's like the idea of academic publishing in journals makes a lot of sense if you don't have the internet. If you do have the internet, academic publishing loses 95% of its relevance because it's actually not necessary. You have way faster, better, higher quality information exchange outside of the academic setting entirely. So I think that's the new paradigm. It gives me lots of hope that we have so much more potential for reach than people stuck in the old system. Old academics who are talking about bad ideas with, trying to justify failed systems are stuck trying to be prestigious by posting academic articles and getting a thing written in the New York Times. New intellectuals, the new generation, we can reach like 1 million-fold more people.
Jordan
we don't have
Peterson,
to do
Ben Shapiro.
Yeah,
it's insane. It's insane.
And there's no upper limit to it. Anybody can do this, and it can scale to like literally the whole world. That's never been possible before. The average, but like me, I started as just some schmo, just some dude, started my own podcast nobody knew about. And I've literally traveled the world talking with some of the most prestigious intellectuals in the world, trying to embarrass them because I'm not impressed by them, generally speaking. But I've had awesome professional opportunities starting from zilch, and I don't have a degree in philosophy. It's just a thing that I've created ex nihilo out of nothing because of the technology. And I don't think I'm anything close to unique in this. So that just gives me so much optimism.
Why don't you think they're special? Like, what about them makes them less special in your opinion?
What do you mean them less
Oh,
special?
okay, well, I'll rephrase because I don't like how I said that. Um, you had said that you met with a lot of these different people and you were trying to prove them wrong because
Oh
they
yeah,
weren't impressive to you. So like,
yeah.
what about the way that they're going about things is mostly unimpressive to you?
Oh no, I meant their ideas are terrible.
Why?
I think the reason is because they had their brains broken by school. That's my
Okay,
best.
explain
Yeah,
this.
yeah. Explain this idea more.
Explain this because I I understand what you mean, but I think that we believe that what exists has to exist. So then it's like this is.
Right. Yeah,
Um,
exactly. That the what is best fallacy. It's whatever
yeah.
is got to be the way that it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess most people don't understand the issues with school. Or like
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've become only more radicalized as I've gotten older. So I was homeschooled growing up. I got to, which allowed me all kinds of things I didn't realize as I was being homeschooled. I had tons of time to research whatever I wanted, generally speaking, however I wanted, in as much depth as I wanted. And it was great. I got real learning done because, well, the way I see it, all education is ultimately self-education.
Yeah.
Somebody can't talk at you and then whoop, you learn. It has to be an internal process. Now, homeschooling at the time allowed me to try to satiate my curiosity as much as I wanted. It was just all constant learning, and not all of it, because some of I still had some curriculum, and those were like the worst part of the homeschooling experience. The stuff that I was forced to do was not really the stuff I should have been doing. You know, my parents were also pretty much first gen homeschoolers. Like, we were actually connected to a family in New York that was involved in the first legal case around homeschooling that made it legal. Homeschooling
Wow.
was an unclear regulatory thing in the 90s in New York. And so
Mm.
we knew the people that were in the landmark case in New York that said, okay, no, this is legal. So this was first gen. My mother, God bless her, she didn't want to homeschool, but she felt for religious reasons she needed to because she didn't like what was being taught in school. So she thought she had to get the curriculum, and we were going to have a classroom and blah, 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 blah. And she was going to teach, on a board and all of that. And as time progressed, almost all of that structure fell away. She also was having some health issues, so she couldn't really do much. She was just saying, like, this is what you need to learn, go do it, and then I'll test you on it. And that worked really well. Anyway, so I got to start college early. I started college when I was 16 and I graduated when I was 20. And I was so naive when I went to college because my mother, God bless her, she thought when I would cut corners doing my homework or whatever, she'd go, you can't get away with this in college. And I thought, okay, college is the real deal here. They really care about your careful thinking. And I went there and I'm like, what? Where are the careful thinkers? What is going on? I had this fantastically naive idea that's only would be more naive in today's school system. I was in college in 2006 to 2010, and it was crazy then. A bunch of nonsense, terrible ideas, terrible pedagogy. The way that they would teach was garbage. But in the last 10 years, things have only gotten crazier. I look at what's happening. I talk to young people who are in colleges, like, what are you guys doing? This is a madhouse. So anyway, I had a weird relationship with schooling, and I was just totally disgusted. By the time I got my bachelor's degree, I just thought, this is a joke. This whole thing is a joke. Now, I think in hindsight, I have, in developing my philosophy of education more, it looks like to me, if you were going to try to design a system to break the souls and the minds of young people, it would look a hell of a lot like formal schooling, both K through 12. I mean, maybe not K. How about second grade through 12th grade and the higher educational system? It kind of looks like prison to me. These people, and like kids are smart. Kids are making all kinds of inferences about how the world works, even if they don't learn what's formally taught to them. They learn things about like how the world works. They infer them. So, for example, when you go to school, you sort of think that there's the expert telling you the true information, and your job, young citizen, school child, is to learn and to repeat it back. And then if you do what you're told, we will grade you well. And we, the enlightened class who are judging you, will put you on the right track so you will have professional career success at the right point, and you will be recognized for your academic excellence. That's the type of thing you infer, that there's this system out there that's filled with competent people that if you just listen, you listen to what they say, you repeat it back to them, and you do what you're told, you'll get handed success. Now that is a complete lie. That is the exact, if you want to live a miserable life, that is the belief that you should hold, because the world doesn't work like that. Thank goodness. So that would be one example where I go, okay, well, the people that did well in high school are oftentimes the people that did well in college. Like some of my fellow classmates in college were utter nincompoops. And yet some of them, some percentage of the nincompoops went on to grad school. And I'm sure some percentage of them are going to be college professors in the future. So I'm looking at the college professors that are teaching me that I don't have much of respect for. I go, oh, all you are is my colleague aged 10 years. And I'm thinking of this whole system is tosh. It's garbage. The ideas were bad. There's no intellectual discussion. It's all about conformity. And it's only gotten worse with the whole COVID thing. And now we do everything online and make sure we wear our masks for a pre-approved amount of time of the day. The whole thing looks like a complete wreck. So when I'm then investigating ideas that are coming from the system, I'm going, oh, there's no mystery. There's no crazy confusion about how this whole thing happened. The system is catastrophically broken. And why would we expect high quality ideas to come out of the system at all?
Interesting. Do you think that there are, I mean, obviously there are some good professors, there are some good academics.
Definitely.
What makes them good?
How have they met? How can some people go through the schooling system and preserve the integrity of their soul? I'm not entirely sure. It definitely happens. Like there are some people that it doesn't break somehow. And I have spoken with some people that I respect who say, oh, my college education was actually good. I had good classes and good professors. Like, okay, cool. It's got to be out there, right? You're talking, the school system involves tons and tons of people. So you're going to have circumstances like that. But I don't really know what factors lead towards, competence in the educational system. I am perplexed by the handful of people that have managed to preserve their integrity in such a terrible system. Especially nowadays. I just don't know how professors can do it.
That is interesting. What's interesting too is that, so like, in my own experience, my school, my college, I would consider it one of the better colleges, specifically because they focus a lot on classical education. So it's more rooted in philosophy and all of these other things. Like because of school, I've read, Plato and Aristotle and all of these good things to have read. I would say though, the one thing, even though the formation was not bad, I still had too many rules in my mind about what society needed to look like.
Definitely. Well, especially if you're reading Plato all day, that guy will get you. I don't think there's going to be all kinds of rules for a well-ordered society.
Do you not like Plato?
I like some things he has to say. I'm not a huge fan of his political ideal. I think that's led to all kinds of
King?
Yeah, that notion I think has led to all the idea of trying to find the political ideal by having the enlightened class of intellectuals who teach young citizens in the ways of civic virtue. I just don't think that is a good way of going about things at all.
Because you're not idealistic in the sense that would not get corrupted.
Because I don't think so. I think the world is very complex, and this makes me partial to market solutions to a bunch of things. Like I like the free market a lot because I think it can handle the complexity of the world better than any central group can. I think the same thing about political structure. The idea that you're going to have an enlightened class shepherd the next generation into political power if they're well educated, and then you have citizens who understand their role in the polity. I just think I think the world is too complex for that. And that's just a recipe for disaster. That's a recipe to have a pseudo-intellectual led society. I don't think there is any philosopher competent enough to be a philosopher king. And the ones that have reached some level of competence and wisdom and understanding, I think the first thing they do as philosopher kings is try to figure out how to dismantle the office. I think these types of things are better handled, are better suited for entrepreneurs than philosophers, especially modern philosophers. Good heavens. I would not want to be a citizen of the present philosopher king's kingdom. No way.
You said something in a different interview. I believe it was your interview on the class systems, where you were talking about the fact that most rulers that are good, most people that are really, really great leaders don't actually want to lead.
Yeah.
They just feel a moral responsibility too, which is interesting.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I mean, Friedrich Hayek's good on this. Friedrich Hayek was an interesting intellectual economist,
Yes.
social philosopher, and he has a bit in a book called The Road to Serfdom. It's a chapter called Why the Worst Get on Top. He essentially says the incentives of political structures are such that the worst people, the most Machiavellian, the people with the least character, end up at the top of the system. And it's not, and you don't have to have like a moral judgment. Oh, these dang jerks. It's more like you can almost think of it as I don't know, a natural output, a mechanical output, an inevitable output of a system that's designed a particular way. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that in general, with some few exceptions, the people that are drawn to political power are not the people that you want to have political power. And I think that the reciprocal is true, that if you're going to have a political structure, who do you want in power in the political structure? It's somebody who's like, look, I don't want to run your life. I don't want to control you. I don't want to try to force my vision of the ideal onto everybody if they disagree. You would want somebody who's not really drawn to, acting in the world that way. I think that's true. I think it's a curse. And I think, not to go too deep into political philosophy here, but I think it's one of the reasons that people have not been conceiving of political philosophy the right way. The way that they frame things, unless they're anarchists, the way that they frame things is like you're designing inevitable problems into the fundamentals of your political structure. The fact that you're saying there has to be the class who are elected, or maybe they have a divine right to rule, that are going to govern everybody else, whether they like it or not, and they're going to extort taxation from them, whether they like it or not. I just think you're not going to resolve the problems. Versus like there are other, the market, for example, provides solutions that we love in every other domain that it exists. So it's like, medicine's not a good example because the state's really involved with that, but like the production of computers is extraordinarily complex. Wow, what complex machinery goes into the production of computers. And yet it's not a political thing. You don't vote for the CEO of the company that will provide the community with the computers. There's none of that mechanism whatsoever. It's just like entrepreneurs who see problems in the world, are trying to solve them, and are producing things that other people find valuable. And that solves the complexity problem in a really elegant way. So I tend to think that's where better solutions lie in the domain of politics, is in markets.
Okay, so one question that I have along those lines, I was talking to somebody, the episode before you, it'll be about climate tech, and he was basically saying, we were talking about a little bit about the tax on carbon, and I was saying that it's probably not a good thing, and then he was saying that. I was saying first that I want to understand it more because I don't understand it, but I don't like the idea that somebody can tax me for something. And I mean, whatever. And so, so it was interesting because he was saying that it's an incentive for government. It's a government placed incentive for businesses. So how would a free market put incentives, I guess, for something like, I don't know, sustainable goods? Like you have all of these computer tech companies that are building all of these products in really bad conditions. They're barely paying anybody. How do you make it so that, like, you can't make it though? So like, how do you move it in the direction so that a free market sustains sustainability?
Yeah, so this would open up a whole nother discussion we won't be able to get into, but I'll give you some very summarized arguments. So first I would say, I don't think it's the case that computer manufacturers are actually doing something evil when they're employing people for low wages. So what happens is the reason that people accept jobs in factories is because they think the work that they're doing is worth, it justifies the wage that they're getting. So it's not slave labor. It's people who have said, hey, for the sake of myself and my family, for whatever reason, I'm going to voluntarily accept these wages for the work that I'm putting out. I'll go a little aside here. So the temptation is naturally to say, well, wouldn't it be better if they paid their laborers better? Here's one of the unintended consequences of having our empathy not carefully applied to the world. So in India, they used to have child labor. This was I think the middle part of the 20th century. I'm not exactly sure the dates here, but they said child labor is obviously unacceptable. They made a moral point, which is a complex one, but let's go with it. Let's say child labor is unacceptable. So we're going to have laws that prevent children from working in factories, which seems reasonable. Unfortunately, that has unintended consequences, because what happened after the passing of the child labor law in India? Well, we had a reduction of child labor in factories, and we had a skyrocketing of child prostitution. Why?
Oh,
because the children were working for a reason. Their family needed the wages. So it's not an easy decision to send your kid off to a factory, but it might be that in reality, you're faced with the necessity of having your child make money because you're in poverty. And if they don't have the option of going to the factory, they might go into prostitution. So I don't think anybody would say that, child prostitution is favorable to working in a factory. So that's the circumstance in a lot of poor places. The factories, from our standards, look like, wow, they're not paying enough. They're in bad circumstances. But there's a reason that the laborers are choosing to work there. It's because it's better than their alternatives. And a lot of times it's significantly better. So like in the case in the Henry Ford, for example, who was the guy that made all the cars, developed the assembly line, would pay his factory workers like, I don't know, it was multiples of what they could get in other professions. He was paying them a fortune compared to what they could get being farmers and other things. So it was exciting for the people at the time, or a good decision for the people at the time to work in the factories rather than work elsewhere. Now, there's a general point here, which is to say, who should make the decisions about what types of people work in factories? I think the most elegant solution is to say the individuals involved. That is to say, it's not, there shouldn't be some regulatory body that says this is the wage that must be paid, and these are the circumstances, these are the rules you have to follow in order to have employment. I actually think the system works much better for all kinds of reasons if you allow people to voluntarily engage in contracts that you might disagree with or you might think aren't fair. So I could probably make the argument that the existence of computer factories are a net positive for the people working in them. I could make that argument for a lot of reasons, not least of which is that I bet the people working in the factories would make the same argument. Because if they wouldn't make that argument, they wouldn't be working there. If they have better options, they're not going to choose their worst option. They're going to try to choose their best option. So that's one point I would just say about the factory circumstance. In terms of pollution, though, this is an interesting area. How do markets deal with things like pollution? It's more complex, but you could say that where there is proof of damage, you can have lawsuits. You can have private lawsuits. Most of law, in fact, is private. Most international contracts are not enforced by states. They're enforced by private arbitration agencies, private courts. There's like more law going through private court systems than public court systems. So if you have an actual damage claim, the idea is, and historically this has been the case, you can sue. Now, then you get complex questions about where does the law come from? Is the law a private thing? Is the law a public thing? And that's a very technical, interesting philosophical discussion. But as an overarching point, I would say markets are sufficiently powerful to be able to deal with problems of pollution. And just one more point, when you actually look historically at the cases of the worst polluters, the factories putting chemicals into the water, into the local lake, which has happened, and it's crazy and tragic. I would guarantee almost all of them, if not all of them, I couldn't claim all of them because I haven't looked at all of them, but for a heck of a lot of them, one way or another, you'll find a connection to the government. And it's in fact the government issuing permits for pollution. So if the government wasn't issuing permits for pollution for political purposes, the people would be dealing with more lawsuits. If you're a factory and you're polluting the local water supply, you're going to have a lot of angry people on your hand. Well, if you're a factory that has permission from the state that you can pollute the water supply, those people don't have any recourse. So historically, that's been where the pollution's been coming from. It's in fact the state saying this amount of pollution is okay, and the state's probably been too lax on what level of pollution is okay. That's the summarized argument, but yeah.
Interesting. That is so interesting. One thought. So while you were saying the thing about India, I had not recently, but a little while ago, watched this thing, and it was basically explaining that there are a lot of children without families in India. But this one woman she had first adopted a child, and then she went to visit India, and she started to learn that the reason that there were so many children that did not have families in India, the reason that there were so many children in adoption places, etc., was because of the fact that families couldn't afford it, and they wanted their kids, but they couldn't. And so that's so interesting, and I wonder if there's a thread to the same thing.
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt in my mind. So India has a long history of socialism. And the same thing has happened in China, where they had the one-child policy for decades, where they said, the government said you're only allowed to have one child. And so there were unintended consequences, like girls would be aborted or killed after birth because boys were more valuable. They could bring home more income than the girls. And so you had terrible family situations. You had undocumented people where a family might have multiple kids, but officially they don't have multiple kids, because if they're officially on the record that they have multiple kids, they're going to be in trouble with the state. So I would bet my life savings that if you investigate the India situation, you're going to find there are overbearing regulations which make it financially extremely difficult to have a bunch of kids. Now think historically here, like you used to have big families, a century ago, a couple of centuries ago, before the invention of birth control, you had really big families. And a lot of times they stayed together. They had to stay together as a family to work on the farm or make enough money to make ends meet. So the idea that you're going to have kids and literally abandon them, that goes against all of our biological programming. It's like that's the last thing that a parent wants to do, is abandon his child for financial reasons. So when you have aberrations like that, I guarantee that you're going to find huge government involvement.
Interesting.
And regulation from the philosopher kings, if you will.
Love that. That gave me a lot of food for thought. Okay, you said The Matrix was your favorite movie.
Yeah.
Why? When did you first see it? What was that
man?
like?
I think I don't know. I saw it shortly after it came out. Well, I like the martial arts, and so the fight scenes are awesome in The Matrix. That's one reason, but also the whole concept. I mean, it's such a mind-blowing idea. Like, people are trapped in alternative reality. They don't know it. Some of them know it and they escape it. Some of them maybe suspect it, but they don't want to escape it because they like the fake reality. It's a wonderful philosophical movie. And like I said, the fight scenes are awesome.
How do you think it pertains to where we are today?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty directly, right? It might be the case that through the methodology of critical reasoning, independent investigation, thinking for yourself, being more of an individual, you discover that a bunch of publicly held and repeated beliefs are false. And if that's the case, it's sort of like getting sucked out of the matrix. And you find if you do this, that there's a lot of people who do not want those questions asked. They don't want those ideas investigated. And even if they suspect that maybe you're onto something, they're comfortable being in the matrix. And that there could be multiple levels of paradigm shifts as you learn more about the world and figure out how it actually works. And it's sort of like getting sucked out of the lesser matrix, and you get closer to the truth, and you get closer to the truth, and you get closer to the truth. And then there might be like almost nobody there, but maybe maybe it's worth it. Maybe it's not. I don't know. I think it's a great movie for our times, right? Because there's a lot of people who seem to be living in different realities all at the same time.
So the Matrix is your perception of reality, basically.
It's a good analogy. I wouldn't say I'm perceiving it that way. That's probably a little bit too strong. I would just say a lot of the themes about
I mean you
truth.
inclusive. So like the
Yeah,
Matrix, whenever they say the Matrix, they mean perception versus truth.
something like that. So you could think of the Matrix as our experiences, and then we are trying to interpret our experiences in the way that's closest to truth. And so even though we're all maybe experiencing things within the same system, we all have our experiences. We all have different experiences of the truth. And there are groups of people that think reality works one way, groups of people that think reality works another way, and they fight sometimes. Epic fight scenes with bullet time dimensions. They shoot each other, and then maybe there's more layers where there's smaller groups, little esoteric groups here and there. They go, oh no, actually, this is the way reality works. And there's also an interesting theme there, which is like the reality that people think they're living in is constructed maliciously, sort of. It's just pseudo maliciously. I don't know, by the machines that are trying to extract resources from them. Essentially, I think there is some disturbing truth to be found there as well. I don't think it's coincidental that a lot of people are deeply confused about the nature of power. And I
In
think
what sense?
so. Let's talk about like taxation, for example. Taxation is a pretty good setup if you can get it right. If you're the person receiving taxes, it's an extortion racket, more or less. It's like you get free money. Yeah, that's great. It would be in the interest of the tax receiver to not communicate the truth of the nature of the relationship of the taxpayer versus the tax spender. So if let's bring it out of taxation and say, let's say you're in a relationship with somebody, and they are in your bank account, and you're not really sure maybe they're in your bank account, but you're not really sure how much. But the person is like making a lot of money in your bank account, unbeknownst to you. It is in their interest to make sure that you remain confused about the nature of that relationship, because if you became aware that they were stealing from you, then you might be very angry and try to change things.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I think that I would bet a lot of money that the ignorance that people have towards a lot of world events and a lot of power structures is not coincidental. I also think the educational system has something to do with this. I wish I remembered, I don't remember the name of these thinkers off the top of my head, but there was a school of thought about a century ago when a lot of things started going off the rails, which said that what we need public schools to do is to create compliant factory workers, because a lot of factory conditions are not particularly conducive to human flourishing. So if we can find a way to craft more compliant factory workers who will accept lower and lower wages, that would be good for society. And so I think Fichte was one of the names that's coming on. Anyway, it's like a school of philosophers saying this in public, writing it down. And there are some German schools, like in Prussia, for example, where they try to essentially break the spirit of humans to make them more compliant factory workers so that their system would be more efficient or whatever. That's the type of thing where I go, okay, if the receiver of the education was aware of the motivation of the person educating them, there might be trouble. So that's what I'm saying. The nature, power can be very malicious. Predators can be very malicious, and I think it is in the interest of the predator to keep his prey confused and not aware of what's going on. And that's a very, very, very scary idea, by the way. There's many rabbit holes that you can go down in which I think that dynamic is true, that people in power are lying so that they can stay in power effectively.
And it's an interesting thing, like it, how do I say this? It's difficult sometimes. And I think it's really difficult because like I like to give people the benefit of the doubt a lot of the time.
Yeah.
I think I have to entertain those thoughts because time and time again, you see the Gulag, you see Holocaust, you see like all of these things that people don't think are possible happen. And so then it's like, okay, you have to entertain these thoughts. I give every individual the benefit of the doubt, as in, I think you're doing what you think is correct.
Yeah.
but then it boils down to values, and I don't think that everybody has the same values, and that's where I would definitely question people.
I was just reading about this. Is fascinating. The idea that you can have large structures of people who might ultimately be doing bad things in the world, even if only a tiny amount of those people know what's going on. So like you brought up the Gulag example, there are so many people who were involved in the creation of that system. And I bet if you were to examine the minds of 90% of them, they don't think of themselves doing something evil. I think they just don't have knowledge of the big picture. They don't see, I've heard stories, I don't know if they're true. I've heard stories that at the end of World War II, there are some Nazi diehards who got wind of what happened with the Holocaust. They didn't even know the Holocaust was going on. And they like committed suicide because they thought, oh my gosh, I've devoted myself and my energies to something that's just profoundly evil. So I think that type of thing can happen. And unfortunately and disturbingly, I think psychos and sociopaths know this. They know that they can recruit lots of people who aren't intentionally malicious, who can accidentally be caught up in a system that is not good for humans. I think actually the educational system might be one of the best examples of that right now. On net, I really think our educational systems are bad. I think they harm people. I think they harm people deeply in their psychology. They don't just confuse them about how the world works. I think they hurt their soul. And I don't think that's because all teachers and professors are malicious that are trying to do this. They're just sort of swept up in a system that is not structured in a skillful way. And there might be some, if you try to trace the origins of these ideas to their root, you might find a couple of nefarious characters that sort of know what they're doing. I would say the same thing about the medical establishment, by the way. I think there's a lot of harm. I think is it not the leading cause of death is like medical malpractice? I don't think that's because doctors are all evil, malicious people. They just have a bad education and are accidentally involved in a very corrupt system. So what a happy note to end this interview on. Yeah.
I know. Okay. So I do have 2 or 3-ish rapid fire questions if you're okay with that.
Okay. Yep.
Very rapid fire. Promise. Okay. So what do you value in life?
Truth, which means love. I think at the end of the day, truth and love are probably the same thing.
Love. Okay. What is a good life?
Oh my goodness. Rapid fire question. What is a good life? You're just going to throw that out there?
Off the top of your head.
I would say trying to live in accordance with the truth as best you understand it.
I like that. If you could only leave one piece of advice for the world and generations beneath you, what would it be?
I don't know. It's going to be hard because I think every era is very different. So for people who exist in the next few decades, I would say keep open the possibility that everybody around you is wrong about their most fundamental ideas. You might be in a dark age. For people 100, 200, 500 years, I don't know. I couldn't say more than, try to live in accordance with the truth. That would be my recommendation.
Love that. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This has been an absolute pleasure. And
been a blast.
Yeah. And I'm so glad to have had this conversation.
Likewise. Thanks.
I hope that you found this episode enriching. I would love to hear your thoughts. If you would like to write a rating or a review, that would be fantastic. You can also follow me at In Bloom Podcast. I'm looking forward to our next episode. Cheers.